Hello and welcome everybody to this week's podcast. We have given it the title, Elbows Up Scotland. Now, this is a discussion we're going to have with Bill and Isobel, but we don't actually use that phrase in the discussion. So we thought we would just explain what we mean by that.
You know, it's been elbows up Canada and they've just had their election, and it's about ice hockey, isn't it? And it's what you do if you're in an awkward thing. You're no more Mr. Nice Guy. So we thought that would be a good title for this chat with Isobel and Bill.
And it is appropriate because it's originally a phrase that was to do with Canadian ice hockey star from way back. But it's kind of been repurposed in the attitude they've taken towards Trump's attack on Canada. And it's galvanised the country. And it's clearly paid dividends for Carney because he got elected.
Yeah, so, you know, come on, Scotland, elbows up. Yeah. Canada wasn't for sale. Well, I'll tell you, Scotland shouldn't be for sale either.
Good point. Anyway, let's get into our conversation with Bill and Isobel and see what you think.
We're really pleased to have Bill and Isobel back with us. It's our regular duo of guests. We're recording this on the 2nd of May. So yesterday was the local elections down in England. So we're going to have a little look at that to kick off. And then after that, we're moving into a subject that Bill suggested to us a while back, just to look at underlying social trends and, you know, where expectations that we might have had about things going forward in our society and standard of living, even the age that you might expect to live to. Those things, there's shifts going on there. So we'll kick off with these election results. Well, Nigel Farage is looking terribly pleased with himself this morning, even though not very many of the seats have actually got counted yet. But he has got another MP, which is not bad going when you wipe out a huge Labour majority in a first-past-the-post system.
How did you respond to the news, Isobel?
There is a kind of Western society element emerging, you know, the new right, the widespread anger and I think confusion among so many of the public. And that applies in Europe, in the US, and it takes different shapes. There's a UK dimension, but there's also a Scottish dimension, which is a bit different again. And I think it was interesting this morning in listening to quite a bit of the commentary that they kept talking about them. We now have a 5-party system. And some of them actually said in Britain, without referencing the fact of not just the SNP, but the rise of Plaid in Wales. So there are these wider trends, and Scotland isn't escaping from them, but there are certainly also differences. And I don't think it's too difficult to understand why this is emerging, because there is growing inequality, and it's very much the gulf in inequality between the very rich and the rest. It's not even between the middle class and the working class, it's the very rich and the rest. And there's also a feeling that so much is failing in society. I think that's very important in the UK. Services all around seem to be getting worse. People's ability to communicate, to influence change, to get responses seems to be getting worse and worse. And therefore, you get a reaction. And of course, in the UK, a significant part of that reaction is the utterly abysmal Starmer Labour Party, which there should have been a bit of a honeymoon, a bit of a feeling, oh, well, we've chucked the other awful lot out. So now we're going to get something a bit better. And they really feel they're getting nothing that's better.
Yeah.
If you can look at what's common to the UK and 2 or 3 other countries, but then what's different from the UK and Scotland, or an additional factor, what I'll call the distrust in the political centre, and by that I mean the centre right and the centre left, and that's quite a broad basis. You've got to remember that the centre right in Germany 6 or 7 years included Angela Merkel, whose policies, according to some political scientists, was the same position to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, right? Right through to the Democratic Party, that sold the past to Trump, where the Democratic Party ignored Biden's economic successes because the economic successes were based in policies that Sanders and the squad had forced on them. And hell was going to freeze over before Kamala Harris was going to talk about the economic successes. All they did was talk about Trump's a criminal, Trump's a criminal, Trump's a criminal, and it's self-evident he can't be voted for. And also, what Yanis Varoufakis says, without the political centre over the past 10 years behaving as it does, he reckons Trump wouldn't have been elected. Then you've got in France, you've got a similar situation. And also in the UK, you've got a similar situation. And to some extent, you've got it in Scotland as well, but it's got slightly different characteristics. And as Isobel said, there's a Welsh version as well. So the way I sort of see it is, and Fiona and Marlene were there as well, the Electoral Reform Society did a conference last Saturday in Edinburgh, and one of the most interesting speeches was from Mark Drakeford, the former First Minister of Wales. Indeed, in my opinion, he was easily the most insightful presentation. His conclusion was a different sort of Britain, and I don't agree with him on that. But what he was clearly pointing at was a Britain that was falling apart. Now, one could say falling apart over delivery of public services and so on. But you can also say, and I think this is reasonably say, falling apart in terms of the diversions between Scotland and England is increasing. The diversion between Wales and England is increasing. The diversions over certain Brexit crises in Northern Ireland is increasing. And therefore, there is that element. Now, it's not different, but it's a variation in those elements. And even to some extent, and I'm in the national executive of the Scottish National Party, you can see it in voter distrust. And this goes right across the political spectrum. Another thing from last Saturday was, and I don't have the graphic here, there was this phenomenal graphic where it showed you trust in politics. And this was across the party political spectrum in Scotland. And it was quite small. I'll call it, say, 3 out of 10. Trust, that was 3 out of 10 trust in politics. On supermarkets, it was sitting somewhere like 6 out of 10. On the NHS, it was sitting at 7 out of 10. So there's no point, me as a member of the Scottish National Party, sugarcoating that. That 3% included the independence parties as well. So there is a huge distrust. It'll shape out a little different in Scotland. And we've got the by-election coming up in Hamilton, and the intervention, question mark, of reform in that by-election is going to be interesting as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that those stats that came out of Mark Diffley's presentation at that meeting, to be honest, I just kind of felt like some of those stats, they were comparing apples and pears. I mean, you know, the basis in which you'd say you trust a supermarket is really different from the basis in which anyone would say I trust a politician or even I trust the NHS. So I kind of wasn't so much of a fan of that. But it will be interesting to get the details back, because they're going to email us. So
Isobel and I just started talking before we started recording, actually, on this point. But when you looked at the spread of the institutions, the ones at the lowest end were the ones that had the least, they were the furthest away from the voter. And, you know, from Westminster, and then slightly less bad was Holyrood, and slightly less bad was local council. So it sort of creeps up as face-to-faceness increases. I'd originally thought supermarkets, Tesco, global giant, what's that got to do with anything? But what Isobel pointed out was, but if you look at communities, and I live in a small town of 3,000 people, our local co-op is in many ways the heart of the community. They know all the people who buy things. We know all the... It's about being close to the people who you want to trust. And that kind of brings us back to that whole thing about local democracy. And I think there's big wins in there for Scotland if we got serious about changing the place at which that democracy happens.
Absolutely. And of course, the SNP used to have the advantage, still does to some extent, and the other pro-Indy parties, that the case for independence was seen as changing the system as democratising things.
Yeah.
The problem is that the performance in government, now, this happens. I mean, it's a fairly universal thing that tends to happen with parties, even if they start off a bit radical, is that they get into a bubble. They get into an establishment bubble, and they find that decisions have been presented to them that are largely civil service, corporate, lobbying. This is how they mix, and they get tired. But the people, unfortunately, they often seem to end up having the energy to fight are the radical elements who are challenging them. And the difficulty that the SNP has got to be aware of and has got really to do something about is that they have chosen, and their leader very much exemplifies this, to be the middle, Mr. Middle management, middle Scotland. And the one thing for years they have been very reluctant to do is really to come out, especially when big vested interests are involved, to come out and explore and cooperate with the groups who have ideas about changing Scotland. But my gosh, the work, the effort to get very modest changes on the whole land issue in Scotland from an SNP government. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty, you have a disastrous set of decisions made by CMAL, and then they go and reappoint again the same people who've made very bad decisions, because it's all part of that middling bureaucratic and corporate establishment. And they've got caught in it.
Then the follow on from that is that the people who are interested enough to look to see who's been reappointed, but who are interested in these things, we get fed up with it. You sort of go, oh, what have we done? So that's it's a good example of how people do lose. Maybe it is confidence, but people just go, oh, what's the point? I might as well, go and do something I enjoy at the weekend rather than sitting writing an article about such and such or going to a meeting and so on. So I guess that all feeds into the kind of underlying thing about, you could say, not having confidence in politicians. I think, Fiona, you made a good point there. Sort of people feel distanced. And part of that distance is, I can write an email, but I'm not going to get any reply. I can go and talk to someone, but it won't make much difference in the long term. So that's the kind of underlying currents that are happening, and it's such a shame. And so SNP have been in power for a long time, and actually they've done some good stuff. Mr. Middle is a good description.
On the other hand, I'm not defending everything my beloved party says, but many of the features of the problems are common virtually everywhere. So it's not down to a particular person. The cultural thing is across the board. But I think what is missing is a realisation of how broken the United Kingdom actually is. There is a tendency, when we talk about broken Britain, we look at how Scotland is less broken. And that's true. Scotland is less broken. If you look at Danny Dorling's book, Shattered Nation, which is about the UK as a whole, I got it and it took about 40 odd notes. And among those notes, there are about 8 or 9 where he points out mitigations that the Scottish government achieved. But the problem is, in an electoral contest, political parties have got a habit of overplaying the mitigation or having difficulty in admitting things are a mistake, or they'll put in a policy that's not the best policy because of resources, but dress it up as virtuous. So there will be some things the Scottish government will say. And in my view, instead he's saying, we've done this, we've got a limited budget, and therefore this is what we can do, right? There's that aspect. But there is another aspect. And here I'm critical of my party, and also because I've just spent a Sunday to Wednesday at the STUC within the trade union movement is taking forward more radical agendas. And there are, the one that Isobel, I think we've all agree on this, is land valuation and the resource that could come out of land revaluation, getting rid of the council tax and bringing something in. But because a political party sees it's electorally dangerous, they're not prepared to take that step. Well, frankly, if my party doesn't start taking those steps, then the crisis is going to get worse. We know from the work of Dorling that Britain has been in decline since Margaret Thatcher came in. We know that since the late 70s, inequality throughout Britain and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland has increased. But we also know that since COVID, but not necessarily because of COVID, there's been a sort of tipping point where things are getting worse. Things between, like, say, 1990 and 1995, things got worse. And then maybe between 2000 and 2005, things got worse. But between 2020 and today, things have got much worse. And it's not just down to COVID. And that means that next year, things are going to get worse again. That steeper decline introduces a politics all of its own. We're seeing disengagement on levels we've not seen before, which brings us back to the rise of reform.
Yep.
The fact that it's rising in England quicker than in Scotland should in some ways be no surprise, because the Scottish people have had a vision put to them about independence as a lifeboat. Some see it as, and many of us see it as, a step change improvement all our lives. We've felt that. But now there's more people who are starting to buy in to independence as a lifeboat because of the state of Britain. And we need to be quite frank about that. And we need to talk about that and what's necessary to make those changes, to take those people on, because this is a problem that the independence movement have. It's not just the SNP, it's the entire independence movement. There is no point going to people and saying, vote for independence because we will improve things, when support for politicians is going down. It's a bit, I don't mean disingenuous, because the people who say it are obviously being genuine. We believe that independence things will get improved. But if we belong to institutions that are promoting independence, yet the trust in those institutions is going down, it behoves us not just to say, vote for independence, things will improve, but this is what we're doing at the moment. We're mitigating and we are failing. And also to take certain things forward and seeking to get extra funds within the devolution settlement. The STUC has signed up to that. And I think that's important. Ros Foy did an article in the Herald in the run-up to Congress, it might have been last Saturday, where she warned, shall I say, the unionist element within the trade union movement, and it's not nearly as strong as it used to be. That's an important point to say, that if Britain continues down this route of broken Britain, then Scotland may well move to independence simply through default. I mean, she made that explicit in her article last Saturday in the Herald. An STUC General Secretary could not have written such an article 10 years before then.
Yeah. Presumably that's also her being able, to feel able to say that. The whole fluidity of what's happening, we can see what's happening down in England particularly. I mean, that must make it easier for someone like her to say that, because it's providing a kind of background rationale for independence. Well,
yes.
we would say it like that. I mean, I know not everyone's going to see it like that. I mean, obviously Mark Drakeford didn't. I agreed with you. I thought what he said at that conference was certainly the best presentation. And I've always really respected Mark Drakeford, actually, when I've seen him, down in the Senate. Because he was describing a different kind of union, and one that certainly would be more equal if it ever came to pass. But I've sat and thought, I'm sorry, Mr. Drakeford, but I am way past that now. And also, I thought what he sounded like the Welsh equivalent of Gordon Brown, when Gordon, who's another guy who can think things through really well, comes up with another solution for Scotland which avoids being independent. And I thought it's the same sort of kind of voice, but it wouldn't happen like Gordon's. Go down to Westminster and they sink like a stone. So probably that would happen with Marx.
I agree with you in terms of his final solution, but his description to me was much more radical than Gordon Brown's.
Yeah. I think you're right.
And actually, if Wales were to implement that description, it would be like a spoke in the wheels of the British state. His vision of that Britain that he talks about would be political poison to the British state, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And in that sense, but let's not get too hung up on, I agree. And then one thing we've got to be careful about is sometimes if one talks about further devolutionary powers, then that could be seen for some politicians within the independence movement, and this is an uncomfortable thing to talk about as well, as that's convenient, isn't it? I mean, for instance, at the moment the polls are suggesting that the Scottish National Party is going to win next year, but there's a huge problem with that. On a low turnout, that's of no use to the route map to independence. If the SNP wins majority power on a low turnout, that doesn't take us forward in relation to independence. For some politicians, there is a potential comfort zone there. We're in, we're the government, we're miles away from a mandate, we'll sit back and simply just become something like in Quebec. That's a danger that the SNP must avoid. But to be fair, and I've sounded like a bit like an ALPA person at the moment, I'm going to say something about ALPA. I don't have a problem, I've got friends in ALPA. But when you look at their policy profile, apart from over, let's say, some identity issues, on economic issues, they're no different from the SNP.
Yeah.
And the proponents, they'll occasionally use adjectives which suggest that on economic issues they're a wee bit to the left of SNP. But I've seen nothing from ALPA that's to the left of the SNP. Now, I'm not criticising it, I'm just analysing it. I mean, personally, and this might be anathema to colleagues in the party, and when I hear them speaking personally, some sort of pact might be worth consideration. Maybe not. It depends on how the discussions would go. I'm not too hung up about that. Frankly, ALPA have not developed, apart from one issue, and the identity issue is a complicated one. But apart from that one issue, I don't see any economic difference between their prospects and the SNP. I mean, I would sooner they actually come back into the SNP. That's my view. And maybe there's some people in the SNP that would choke at that. But that to me would be the solution. Frankly, they might achieve more.
I had a look at their policies not that long ago, and I thought had the same kind of response to it, and they haven't kind of developed anything that's a bit more different then. But then would we have expected them to, really? And then the other thing they haven't done is they haven't broken through getting 1 or 2% in support in the polling. So you kind of look at that and you go, well, that's not even going to be a breakthrough in the list.
What is really quite interesting, that the proportions planning to vote for the Indy parties, and to some extent we can't totally include the Greens there. We can in one sense, but in another sense there are people who will vote for the Greens because of their environmental priorities, but doesn't come up to the proportion supporting independence. So, I mean, that is a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
Are they just not voting, which I suspect is the case, or are they voting for another party? Difficult to know, but that's something that really needs exploration. And I think what we have to focus on is there are great underlying economic difficulties, but there are lots of things that the Scottish Government, within its powers, could have done and could do, and where there's been terrible negligence. One example, and it's one I think many of us perhaps in an older generation have underestimated its significance is housing, because we have so many in a younger generation coming up who haven't got the access, who haven't got the potential that we had when we were younger to buy a home,
Yeah.
and to go on that kind of ladder, or at least to have rent a home where there is more stability than many current rental situations. And how slow the Scottish Government has been over certainly 20 years in acting on that, because it is one area in which there is a lot of economic viability, because housing produces an income stream over time. It's not like the health service where you've got to put the investment in, you're not going to get income back. But in housing, you do. And the reason why it is so important, it's partly that younger generation, but it's also rural Scotland. This is mentioned again and again and again in rural Scotland, and nothing much is done. Now, there was a lot when Commonweal pushed the proposal for the Scottish National Investment Bank. One of the things that it hoped would get a lot of investment into was housing, and was social housing, because again, you can borrow money on that and you can get an income stream back. But look at the board. Look at the people that put on.
I think it's worth taking a minute just to explain how that works, and it's not economically difficult. One, local authorities can borrow. Now, there are some issues, but they should have been teased out. One, local authorities can borrow money. Let's just say a local authority borrows £1 million. It gets it at a cheaper rate. It then builds £1 million worth of housing stock. Now, it gets it at a cheaper rate because everybody, including the lenders, know they're going to get the rent back, whether it's through economically active people or through economically inactive people who are going to get it from their pensions or benefits. So when a council house is built, it creates a revenue stream. So the lenders know the money is going to come back. It literally is growing a money tree. The money is lent, the rentals are paid, and it works. Now, that is an area that needs to be should have been taken forward. And this is important, if Westminster said no to any of the blockages, then fair enough. The Scottish Government could turn around and say that they're stopping us. So if the Scottish Government comes up with a programme and the UK Government says, well, you can't, then the Scottish Government should be saying, stop us. And instead of the Scottish Government listening to their civil servants and says, you can't do that because of this regulation, then start to take it forward. When they ask for that regulation to be lifted, when the UK government say we're no lifting it, then the Scottish government needs to get. That's the sort of politics that the Scottish government needs to start to get into, because otherwise we're not going to get the turnout in the election. In 1978-79, Bill Ramsay was in a political behaviour class in Strathclyde University. And at that time, I think it was McGill University in Canada, for some reason were interested in Scottish politics. And they had done surveys at the time of voter attitudes to constitutional change in Scotland. Then there were three options. The status quo, that was before a devolved parliament. Devolution, that was a potential. Independence. And although support for the SNP then was about 15%, I think when I stood as an SNP candidate in 1987, we went into that election with 15% in the polls. Support for independence was very high the lower the socio-economic grouping you went to. So if you went to social group E, independence was high. Social group D, independence was high, slightly less. And social class C1, high but slightly less. And then C2, and then Bs and As where it gets slightly less. But among the lower social classes, as pollsters would put it, E, D and C1, that's not changed. So we cannot rely on some voting bloc in the middle for the Scottish National Party. We need to cater to people who don't vote. And that actually has always been a paradox for the Scottish National Party. When I was an activist in Kilmarnock in the 1980s, the late 80s, one of the best organised branches in the whole of the SNP, out with a few in the northeast, had 400 or 500 members in Kilmarnock. When we worked in that area, when we focused on voters, it was seen that turnout was crucial. The problem is, switched in 2012, SNP conference, the independence referendum campaign had been in the go for a year or two. Jim Mather chaired the main fringe meeting. There was one guest, Robin McAlpin. And I was standing against the wall, and Robin was putting a new image. The initial independence campaign at 11 was not cutting through. And then younger elements, out with the party, turned to voter registration. And I'll never forget leaning against the wall, looking down the row of a particular row of about 20 SNP delegates from a particular constituency in the northeast, and they were all sitting there with their arms folded. And I knew what they were thinking in their head. You're not going to tell us how to win an election. But that's not what they were being told. What they were being told is winning an election is not enough. You need the turnout. And that's crucial. If we're not having strategies to get turnout, but we're focusing strategies to beat Labour, who are in a disastrous, they're in an electoral death ride on a low vote, that's intellectually lazy, actually.
And that's one of the things that came out of that event of the Scottish Spring, where both Marlene and I pricked up our ears. So Mark Drakeford was saying in Wales they've reintroduced automatic voter registration at 16, and they're doing that in Glasgow as well, aren't they, Marlene?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, that's an easy, quick win. If Wales can do it, why can't we do it? And the point you made about the pick a big topic that impacts on people in a very practical way, like housing, I think is absolutely right. We probably all came from council houses originally, all four of us, and that is such part of our heritage that connects with people, because it's so important. I've got a 30-year-old son who's never going to get his own house because he's on minimum wage. He can't even inherit this one and afford to run it. There's that need is there. But the other thing I think, in that if we were going to get those big topics we keep banging on about, electricity prices, that's something that affects people, it affects services, it affects our transport costs, it affects business costs. If the SNP or whoever wants to be government could pick a couple of big hitter topics and do exactly what you suggest, get bullshit, get in the faces saying, look, we're doing this, we dare you to stop us because this is what our people need, then you could actually get some energy behind that. And that's the thing with the far right, and it's the same with the Brexit vote, it's the same with Trump, it's the same when Johnson got in, and now you were seeing it with Farage. That's people rebelling against a broken system that isn't doing them any good and thinking, well, I might as well have some fun and break it. And what we're seeing in response to Trump, I notice both Canada and Australia have recently had elections, and the Trump effect has worked against their far right rising, and the countries have doubled down on, no, we don't want that, we want this because we can trust it and it's good for us. Now, why can't the SNP be that voice of, look, we're the alternative that will save you from that?
There's a personality factor, there's an institutional factor, they are interlinked. And you had Alec was an entrepreneur, that was in his nature, and he would take a chance. And there are various establishments whom he would play with, but where he was also capable of putting two fingers up to. Then we went on to Nicola. Yes, she had learned certain things at Alec's feet, but basically Nicola was not a real entrepreneur. It was on the surface, it was PR, radical change, but it didn't reflect in policy decision making. And this is the problem. She was head in the company. Alec might have been the entrepreneur. She was head of the PR department and did a wonderful job in that. And then you have John, who's, well, he's the factory manager and will probably do quite a reasonable job as the factory manager, but he's not going to go and set up a new factory or a new company. And unless there is movement that comes from the wider membership, from the elected members in various contexts to change that, it's very hard to see how that culture is going to change because they are in this bubble of continuity and not taking too many risks. And you've got at times to take risks.
My best friend who, during the referendum, which is quite amusing for me, he got into bother with an online conversation group because it was seen as an ultra-nationalist, right? Now, my friend, when we were at university, had just left the Communist Party to go into the Labour Party. And he's had a long journey. His wife has helped him, it has to be said, moving towards the independence position. And he'd got there around about 2011 or 2012, I have to be fair to him. But we've been friends for a long time. But he got a PhD in industrial relations, and about 6 months ago, we were talking about the trials and travails of my beloved party, and he made a fair point. And it's not a criticism, it was a sort of academic observation. And he says, he says, Michel's iron law of oligarchy. And I looked at him, I says, what the hell are you talking about? And apparently, there was it was either French or, I think it was French or Spanish, an academic before World War I, wrote a book called Political Parties. And in it he said, if a political party becomes extraordinarily successful, then the full-time people, the parliamentarians and the staff, then start to take control, and the ordinary members lose their influence and control. Now, Alan was just pointing out to me some basic realities, and that's not a criticism. So I'm not criticising my fellow SNP members who are parliamentarians or councillors or work for parliamentarians or work for, whatever. But there has been, and this is an analytical point that even the supposed academics that study the SNP don't seem to point out. I can remember when the SNP would consist of €1 MP, a handful of MPs, 20, 30 district councillors and 10 or 12 regional councillors or whatever. So we're talking about, let's say, 30 elected politicians, many of whom were part-time, but 6 staff at headquarters. Isobel could tell us, because she was a vice-convener of the SNP up until the 1980s. And therefore, the membership had a bit bigger control. Then things started to change, and actually start to change under Alec. And so when people sometimes refer to say that Nicola has got Stalinist tendencies, so did Alec.
So did Alec, yeah.
But that was almost inevitable. But there was a radical element, and I want to bring, if I may, record this radical element. Now, Winnie had her faults and her benefits and all the rest of it. But I remember, I was there, I'm not making it up. It was a national council in February in the Pleasance in Edinburgh in 1914. I don't know what year it was. It was in the 1980s. And Winnie was doing her Euro MP report. And as some of us, certainly Isobel and me, will remember, when Winnie had a particular rhetorical style, when she was about to make a point in a sort of faux self-depreciating way, she would hunch her shoulder. And she did on one of these shoulder hunches, and she said, at the end of her report, by the way, as your party president, I'm not going to pay the poll tax. Cut to that year's conference in Eden Court Theatre in Inverness. Cut to the tea room. Cut to a young, big-haired and big-shouldered Kirsty Wark with her cameraman and her sound man behind her. She walks into the tea room. She spans the room, and Ramsay and other young radicals are sitting there. And she spots a table of what I will call SNP matrons, and she walks towards them. And we're sitting at the table and going, oh my God, what are they going to say? So she set up her camera and she said, ladies, may I interview? Yes. And they said, ladies, what do you think about this non-payment of the poll tax campaign? And one of them said, well, as our party president, Winnie Ewing, said she's not paying the poll tax, then neither are we. And I mean, at our table, we could have been jumping up and down. So there always has been a radical element within the SNP. Rural action over, its possession of nuclear weapons, even prepared to use non-violent direct action at certain times.
It's just interesting that, because I think what we're kind of saying is that, yeah, there was that radical element. And I mean, when you haven't got very many MEPs and maybe no Scottish government yet, and maybe not very many councillors either, you have to catch the headlines. And one of the things that Alec was really, really good at was catching the headlines, wasn't he? And, you've got to kind of make a splash. And he certainly knew how to do that. So fair enough, things change, and you're running the government in Scotland, and you've got a fair number of MPs down south, and think people settle into that. So we can see that. But, the thing about the kind of radicalness, because some of the examples that, you were talking about like a while back, okay, so you try and take a policy forward, a more radical one, say housing. Someone down south says, no, you can't do that. That's win-win, because if you took it forward, it would be a win. If you try and take it forward and you're stopped by Westminster, that's a shame, and that's not the preferred outcome. But it's still a win politically, and it gets people, behind you. But I'm now sitting thinking, there are some of the MPs that we've still got down in Westminster, and Fiona and I, I must say more Fiona than I, but we both kind of look at what's it's mostly interventions in debates, and some of them they do come over with that more kind of radical, I was going to say cheeky, but it's more than that, because it's very well informed. And I just think maybe it's easier to do it down there when you've only got 9 MPs, and
you're in opposition.
And you're in
a government. Yeah.
But the problem is that certainly for a long time, the SNP leadership hierarchy hasn't even tried to make those kind of links. And I can say Commonweal for, where are we, over 10 years, has produced so many different, very well researched policy proposals across the board, and it's gone out and it's set up policy groups with people who are actually active on the ground in their areas. Yeah. The SNP by and large has never wanted to touch that over that period. It will go to commercial lobbyists. It will bring in this, and you talk about housing, well, it will really listen to the big housing companies doing terribly well financially, some of them, not the smaller ones so much. But it won't go out and listen to critical voices. And you have to say, where is that coming from? And it's coming from the fact that they have absorbed a culture, what they see as a low-risk culture. And the idea of the rebels coming up and questioning it and pushing them to take risks and to do things.
Do you think there's anybody currently in either the party or the government who could start something moving, who could break out of this? Because it would be so nice to have something to vote for, as opposed to just the least worst that I'm presented with.
Exactly.
Yeah, but at the moment, I'm not going to comment on that. But I think there's one thing I think we need to get back to before we finish, which is reform. I was speaking to a prominent SNP politician, I won't say who, a couple of days ago. And we're talking about reform. In fact, I'm going to say two things. One, a prominent trade unionist who said about the idea of having the summit and not having reform. I thought, yeah, I'm not so sure about the summit, but then again, I'm not First Minister, so I'm not going to criticise that. But this prominent senior trade unionist, the Scottish Secretary of a UK union, said, maybe John should have invited reform to the summit and called them out. That's worthy of further discussion.
Yeah.
I think that's worthy of further discussion, because I'm not sure that cancelling them is necessarily a good idea. At the moment, I'm a bit undecided, because when this person put this forward, I thought I hadn't been considered in that, and I think that needs to be considered. And the other thing, and we've seen that literally in this morning's television, we'll see more about, Reform is a profoundly British organisation. Mm-hmm. I scribbled down 2 notes from the person that won the by-election that took place. This person talked about soft touch Britain and compared to glorious Britain, right? Reform is profoundly unionist, and how unionism in Scotland reacts to Reform is going to be fascinating, because Reform are unionist. And I think, for reasons of propriety, the SNP has not, and I have to admit, I supported that position. The SNP has went soft on that. I don't mean unionism, but in terms of things. But I think Reform are going, and I'm not trying to be intellectually lazy, the more we see of Reform, the way they're going to be very overtly British. And it means that hardline unionism in Scotland, and I'm just talking analytically, I'm not talking pejoratively, because unionism in Scotland has been institutional in its own way and in fabrics of Scottish society for a century. Yeah. So the idea of saying that Scottish unionism is a variation of Reform is not true historically. But now Scottish unionism have got to decide, are we going to go behind Reform? And I think many of them will, which means we're going to get a full-blown British unionism. But that is something we will have to face up to, because Reform are unionist. And I don't usually like using the word unionist, because, unionism is part of Scottish fabric of Scottish society. It's part of the culture that I come from. And I'm not decrying it. I'm not saying it hasn't got its place. But the onset of Reform is we're going to have some conversation to see how that teases out, and they may further polarize Scottish politics, which may be a bad thing or maybe a good thing, and that's something that we have to consider, because one of the things that I'll call the soft political centre don't like is polarisation. And if Scotland is in crisis economically, maybe that polarisation is something that has to be considered, discussed, faced up to, and decide how we're going to deal with it, because you won't be able to run away from it.
Yeah, well, when Nigel Farage, if he persists in his policy position, and I didn't actually know until this morning, it was quite as blatant, and I don't know whether he'll try and change it, in saying that the National Health Service should not be publicly financed. Now, my God, push them on their policies, push them what they're proposing. And this is where they're going to run into serious trouble, because they have got on just with the ultra-British nationalist thing. They've got away with basing so much of it, keep the outsiders away.
And if they are cancelled, that will avoid discussion about what Isobel just talked about.
Exactly.
We will actually just talk about the cancellation.
And we'd be better talking about the issue that's driven the rise of them, and make them, explain exactly what is their policy to fix that, and is there any content to it? And so far there isn't, but it's very bankable sound bites.
And a robust response to their economic policies is something that some in the political centre don't want to talk about or find it very uncomfortable. I mean, for instance, one of the things that happened last Saturday was the John Smith Society were one of the contributors. And I had not realised the John Smith Society have appointed as their head a journalist who was also a speechwriter for Ruth Davidson. Now, if you're seeing the Labour Party having literally annihilated the Corbyn faction, and now the Labour Party are incorporating what I'll call One Nation Toryism into their ranks, purge the left, bring in one nation Toryism, then they are no longer, I mean, if that's who's going to be their head, if they're going to have someone who was a speechwriter for Ruth Davidson as their head, then the idea that the John Smith Society can be considered, a player in centre-left politics is decidedly iffy, to say the very least.
Yeah. And that means that the big gap in Scottish politics is going to be on the left.
Yeah. If only we had some left-wing
Labour's on the right, Tories on the right.
Come on, Scottish socialists, we're counting on you. We're going to get Colin Fox back on.
We need to get Colin and Robin back on.
Well, there was, again, and I'm not in favour of this because I'm in the Scottish National. I consider myself often when I attend union events, not as an EIS, wearing my EIS hat, but sort of broader stuff, I will describe myself as Bill Ramsay, petty bourgeois nationalist. And they laugh because they know I'm on the left of the SNP. But the point is, and if folk are outside the SNP and being socialists, that's fine. But it has little electoral salience, and that's not likely to change anytime soon. So I mean no disrespect to people who are socialists, who are outside the SNP, that's fair enough, but they don't have any electoral salience. And I would encourage entryism into the SNP, but that's me. But take it forward in a more radical way. But again, that's up to the members. But again, the SNP members at conferences are much more to the left than the leadership is. And the leadership needs to take cognizance of that. Otherwise, we will sink into being part of the soft political centre.
Do you see any signs yet of that happening, of the membership being listened to more or directing the party more? Has that changed at all since when?
Well, at the Constitutional Conference, and to most people outside the SNP, that's as boring as hell. But in a sense, it will be up to the membership. And the membership will just have to step up to the plate and also challenge to some extent publicly. The SNP had this problem for many years, and I got it wrong, actually. My friend Alan was right. I assumed it was a holdover for the days when the SNP was electorally small. This small group of politicians in a choppy seas in a small electoral boat, and everybody hanging together. And I took that for this conformity within the SNP. Actually, Michelle's iron law of oligarchy is probably more accurate. We need to pick some fights.
Yes.
And that's important. And they say, but God, we're the government. Governments don't pick fights.
That would just inject some energy into the whole thing. Absolutely. Yeah. We'll be there.
We'll be there. I think the four of us will actually all be there picking fights.
Bill, it may be instead of the 79 group, it may be that you need to start to organise and lead the 25 group.
I'm not going to lead anything. The point is, you need to get some parliamentarians to do that. And I can think of one or two that might at some point after the selection processes are over.
It's just been fascinating, as ever. It's just been fascinating. It's never long enough, and I always find myself going off to think about something again, or for the first time, actually, kind of. So thanks very much for coming on. While we've been talking, I have got the BBC website up here on my phone. Yeah. So there's 3 parties down south that have so far won more seats than they've lost, and those 3 are, of course, Reform, hugely ahead. But the other 2 that have gained seats are the Lib Dems, presumably they're taking seats off the Tories, and the Green Party.
Oh, good.
So that and then Labour, of course, and the Independents, they've lost some. But I think on this particular event there was a lot of Tory seats up for re-election. So you kind of expect Labour wouldn't take so much of a dun over it, and the Tories are way down. So anyway, that's what our friends down south have been doing, and. Thanks again. Thanks for coming on. And just to finish again, that word oligarchy has been mentioned a couple of times today. I think we should get together at some point and talk about the effect of oligarchies on elections and democracy, in Britain and maybe even in Scotland as well. But that's for another time.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Great.
So that was an interesting discussion. It always is with Bill and Isobel. Let us know what you think. Do you think that Scotland's interest would be best served by picking a fight with Westminster? Do you not think that's the right way to do it? What do you think? Let us know in the comments.
And picking a fight, elbows up, just kind of saying, listen, we're not being a walkover any longer. You've sold enough of our assets and we want that to stop. If you're not going to stop it, then we're going to do something about it. Try and stop us. We've only got a year before Holyrood. I just hope we manage to get something of that kind of level of energy and just kind of going over the next year. And politicians, you can help.
Yes, because people need to feel that there's a point in voting. There's something in it for them to bother in the first place.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Ms. Nice Guys. We've got our pitchforks ready.
Yes, we have. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.